Hello and welcome to this video resource. This session is intended to prepare you with foundational information upon which you can build your learning during the Personality Disorder Training Day. But first of all, let's have a look at what personality is. Personality is the distinctive and relatively enduring way a person thinks, feels, and behaves in response to life situations. It is enduring because it's relatively stable over time, and it is distinctive between people. We all have our unique combination of personality traits. The current model of personality is the 5-factor model of personality. It looks at personality in terms of 5 dimensions: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotional stability. A person who is diagnosed with a personality disorder would also have these personality traits. However, they would be more exaggerated. So a personality disorder typically would include ingrained maladaptive ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving in response to life situations. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, the DSM-5, defines personality disorder in terms of 3 aspects. The first aspect is about cultural expectations. And here the DSM-5 suggests that a personality disorder is a response pattern that departs from cultural expectations in at least 2 areas. Cognition, this includes perception and interpretation of the self, others, and events. Affectivity, so this is about the range of affectivity, whether it is very narrow or wide, the intensity, the lability, the pace of change, and appropriateness. For example, a person with schizopersonality disorder would have quite a narrow range of affectivity. A person with borderline personality disorder would have quite a rapid pace of change in terms of affectivity. Also, interpersonal functioning. Typically, people who are diagnosed with the personality disorder will have some difficulties in areas of interpersonal functioning, be that in a work context or in a personal context. Largely, all personality disorders will have some difficulty in terms of interpersonal functioning. Now, the last aspect of departure from cultural expectations, according to the DSM-5, is impulse control. And this does not apply to all personality disorders, but it does apply to some. For example, a person with antisocial personality disorder will often show very little impulse control. The second aspect the DSM-5 looks at in terms of defining a personality disorder is how inflexible, pervasive, or traceable these patterns, response patterns, are in terms of behavior, thinking, and feeling. A person who is diagnosed with a personality disorder will typically show a very inflexible response pattern, and they will find it difficult to change. Even if it were to their advantage, even if they want to change, they find it almost impossible to do so. For a person with a personality disorder, these response patterns or maladaptive response patterns will also be pervasive, meaning that they go across all settings. They will have these maladaptive response patterns, thinking, feeling, behaving in work settings, with family, and with friends. It's not just in a particular setting. And usually these response patterns are traceable back to adolescence or early adulthood. The last aspect that the DSM-5 looks at in terms of definition of a personality disorder is that a personality disorder leads to significant distress or impairment in social or occupational functioning. So the response pattern that comes with a personality disorder typically interferes significantly with social or occupational functioning to the point that social and occupational functioning is impaired and the person becomes distressed about this, or also people around them might become distressed. Now let's have a look at these 5 personality dimensions that are part of the 5-factor model of personality. I mentioned before that those dimensions are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotional stability. When we take the Big 5 personality test, which is easily obtainable online, we will all have scores somewhere on each of those dimensions. Some might score low or higher on one dimension than another. However, they will be within that certain range. A person who is diagnosed with a personality disorder, they will still exhibit those traits, but just in a much more extreme form. For example, openness. A person with paranoid personality disorder or obsessive compulsive personality disorder will be extremely closed to new experiences. A person with histrionic personality disorder or schizotypal personality disorder will be extremely open to new experiences, to the point where it becomes unrealistic. Conscientiousness is the second trait. A person with antisocial personality disorder will typically be not conscientious at all, to the point of disregarding any rules and violating the rights of others. Whereas a person with obsessive compulsive personality disorder will be so rules-based that they will find it difficult to complete tasks because they would feel it can never be perfect enough. The third dimension, extroversion, introversion, is another example. A person with schizoid personality disorder or avoidant personality disorder will be extremely introverted to the point of rarely interacting with others at all. Whereas a person with histrionic or antisocial personality disorder might be quite exaggerated in their interaction with others, quite extremely extroverted. Agreeableness, the 4th dimension, in terms of not being agreeable, almost being antagonistic, antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and paranoid personality disorder would fall into that category of being not agreeable, antagonistic. At the other end of the spectrum, at the far end of the spectrum, is being so agreeable, like a person with dependent personality disorder, that they often agree to pretty much anything at all. The last dimension is emotional stability. And here, a person with, say, dependent personality disorder or borderline personality disorder would show emotional instability, whereas a person with schizoid personality disorder, given their narrow range of affect, could be seen to be extremely emotionally stable. There is a lot of discussion around the causes of personality disorder. And while nobody can say for sure, because there is no test to, for the causes of a personality disorder, it is thought that a personality disorder comes about due to the interaction between predisposing factors and stressful life circumstances. And how much could be attributed to predisposing factors as compared to stressful life circumstances differs across the personality disorders. Cluster A personality disorders, for example, are thought to be much more due to heritability, whereas cluster B and C have a much larger component of stressful life circumstances seen to be the cause of the personality disorder. We will go into this in much more detail during the training day and look at each personality disorder in terms of the causes. Another topic of discussion in personality disorders is prevalence. As you can see from these three figures here, there is a great difference between those figures. On the left, you see 7%. This is the estimate that was found by a study by Jackson and Burgess in 2004, looking at Australia as a whole. And they found that about 7% of the Australian population would be diagnosed with a personality disorder. On the right-hand side, the 9% figure relates to a meta-analysis by Winsper et al., who looked at prevalence studies of personality disorders from the last 30 years and found that across the world, looking at all the personality prevalence studies over the last 30 years, the average was 9% worldwide, with some countries being higher and other countries being lower, but 9% being the average. Now, the middle figure is quite different. This relates to a recent study, a recent prevalence study by Quirk and colleagues, who looked at Australia, but only at women over 25. And they found that 22% of women over 25 in Australia would be diagnosed with a personality disorder. Even though they looked at women, we could assume that the figure would not be completely different for men, because in general, in the past, it has been found that there is not a great deal in overall prevalence of personality disorders between men and women. Within each personality disorder, there could be quite a lot of difference, but across the personality disorders, there is not a huge difference between men and women. So we could assume from this that about 20% of the Australian population have a personality disorder. Of course, the question arises, how come in 2004 it was found 7% and in 2017 it was found to be around 20%? And this would typically be due to different ways of measuring personality disorders. And this gives you an idea of some of the problems in terms of diagnosing personality disorders. It is not an easy thing to do. During the training day, we will look at the prevalence for each personality disorder as well as the gender breakup in terms of personality disorders. For example, antisocial personality disorder is thought to be higher in males, whereas borderline personality disorder is thought to be higher or more prevalent in females. And there are also quite big differences across the personality disorders. For example, dependent personality disorder is not that prevalent, whereas narcissistic personality disorder is about 6% in the population. The DSM-5 uses a categorical model of looking at personality disorders. So it looks at 10 distinct personality disorders, And it categorizes these 10 personality disorders into 3 clusters: cluster A, B, and C. Cluster A is the odd or eccentric cluster, and it includes paranoid personality disorder, which has characteristics of distrust and suspiciousness. It also includes schizoid personality disorder, which is characterized by detachment in interpersonal relationships and flat affect. The third personality disorder in cluster A is schizotypal personality disorder, and this is characterized by quite severe distortions in thinking. The next cluster is cluster B, the dramatic, emotional, or erratic cluster. And this includes histrionic personality disorder, which is characterized by an excessive need for attention. Borderline personality disorder, which is characterized by an instability of the self-concept as well as relationships, and also impulsivity. Narcissistic personality disorder, which is characterized by an excessive need for admiration from others. And antisocial personality disorder, which is characterized by violation of others' rights. The final cluster, cluster C, the anxious fearful cluster, includes avoidant personality disorder, which is characterized by social inhibition, dependent personality disorder, which is characterized by a need to be taken care of, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which involves excessive orderliness, perfectionism, and control. Now, this categorical approach to personality disorders that we see in the DSM is based on a diagnostic medical model. It looks at disorders in terms of patterns of symptoms and uses a dichotomous approach where a person is thought to either have a disorder or not have a disorder. For example, if a person meets 5 or more out of the 9 criteria listed for borderline personality disorder in the DSM-5, they could be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. If they met only 3 criteria, then they might not be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. So there are problems with this categorical approach. One is that personality disorders in a categorical approach are seen as very distinct from each other. So rather than being seen as exaggerated personality traits, as I mentioned on the dimensions earlier on, they are seen as distinct constructs. This is particularly difficult when comorbidities among personality disorders are rather high. Cluster A personality disorders, for example, are highly comorbid with each other. So are cluster B personality disorders. If each personality disorder was a completely distinct construct, then it would be less likely that there is such high comorbidity. Another aspect that is a challenge in terms of the categorical approach is that the categorical approach places more focus on the form of a personality disorder rather than on functionality of the person in their lives. For example, the person who might have or might meet only 3 criteria for borderline personality disorder would not be diagnosed even if these symptoms were very severe. Whereas a person who meets 5 criteria for borderline personality disorder might be diagnosed with the disorder even if their symptoms might be milder. And in terms of functioning, the person who meets the 3 criteria but they are severe might have much more problems functioning interpersonally than the person who meets 5 criteria. So these are some of the challenges with the categorical approach. However, I need to stress that the categorical approach is the approach that is currently being used in Australia. The DSM-5's categorical approach is the main model of personality disorders. But this is not to say that it is the only model. There is also a dimensional approach to personality disorders. The DSM-5 provides this alternative dimensional model at the back of the DSM-5. And in this alternative dimensional approach, it looks at personality functioning, which was one of the challenges with the categorical approach. And it looks at personality functioning in terms of 4 aspects: identity. This relates to the stability of the self-image and boundaries. Self-direction, which relates to self-reflection and self-management. Empathy, and intimacy, which relates to connection with others. The dimensional approach to personality in the DSM-5 also looks at personality traits, which largely map onto the 5-factor model of personality that we looked at earlier. The 5 personality traits in the dimensional approach that the DSM suggests are disinhibition versus conscientiousness, with the person diagnosed with obsessive compulsive personality disorder being overly conscientious, and the person, let's say, with histrionic or antisocial personality disorder being very disinhibited, not being very conscientious at all. Another trait is detachment versus extraversion, with the person with histrionic personality disorder, for example, being at the far end of extraversion, being very extroverted, whereas a person with schizoid personality disorder or paranoid personality disorder or any of the cluster A personality disorder would be more at the other end of that dimension, showing detachment in their interpersonal relationships. Another dimension is antagonism versus agreeableness, with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder, for example, being at the antagonistic end, and dependent personality disorder being at the excessively agreeable end. The 4th dimension relates to negative affectivity versus emotional stability, and this maps pretty much on the 5-factor dimension of emotional stability, with, say, people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder being at the end of emotional instability. And finally, there is the dimension of psychoticism versus lucidity. Now, the DSM-5 is not the only publication that is proposing a dimensional approach to personality. The ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases 11th edition, published by the World Health Organization, has moved to a dimensional approach to personality disorders in this 11th edition. This new edition was adopted in 2019 and will come into effect in 2022. The ICD-11 is used largely across Europe. And I'd like to stress again that in Australia, we mainly use the DSM-5 using the categorical model. The ICD-11 looks at severity ratings. And you might recall that this was one of the problems with the categorical approach, that it didn't look at the severity of symptoms. So the ICD-11 looks at severity in terms of frequency, how often, difficult emotional or behavioral patterns emerge, intensity, and pervasiveness. It also looks at personality trait domains similar to the alternative dimensional model of the DSM-5. The ICD-11 looks at negative affectivity, dissocial features, disinhibition, anancastic features, which relates to compulsive preoccupation with rules and perfectionism, and detachment. I hope you have found this very small overview of some of the introductory aspects of personality disorders interesting. And I'd like to now give you a little bit of an overview of what we will cover in the full training day on personality disorders. There will be a brief overview of the causes, but looking at the causes for each of the 10 personality disorders. We will also look at comorbidities for each of the 10 personality disorders, as well as treatments. If there are treatments, there are not treatments for every personality disorder. And we will look at assessment of personality disorder, as well as how, when interacting with people diagnosed with a personality disorder, we might be able to manage some of the more difficult aspects of communication or behavior. So after this brief overview of causes, comorbidities, treatments, and assessment, we will then look at the 10 personality disorders one by one, starting with cluster A, paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorder. Then cluster C, avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And finishing with cluster B, histrionic, antisocial, narcissistic, and borderline personality disorder. For each of these 10 personality disorders, we will look at the diagnostic criteria as they're listed in the DSM-5. We will look at overarching presentations using either a video clip or a case study. We'll look at the schemas that are underlying the different personality disorders, as well as their prevalence in general and split up by gender. And we will look at treatment options, if they do exist, for each personality disorder, as well as ways of managing some of the difficult communication and behavior patterns if we do come across people with personality disorders in our practice. So thank you for your interest. I would like you to join me for the full training day on personality disorders, and I look forward to reviewing the 10 personality disorders with you, as well as the associated characteristics, behaviors throughout that full day of training.